So we're going to just do a quick review of photosynthesis. We're going to talk about some of the important things that you have already learned by reading your article and going through the information that we did on Friday. But I want to just make sure that we really understand the important stuff. So I'm going to just go through a couple of slides with you. There's only 10 of them, just to make sure that you got the basics down. Please make sure you're taking notes on this, and you'll have some questions to do afterwards. So let's just recap photosynthesis. So first of all, photosynthesis, why is this not letting me scroll? There we go. So photosynthesis is the conversion of light energy to chemical energy, right? So we are converting light to chemical, right? And we're going to talk about what that chemical energy is in a second. Hopefully you already remember what type of energy is created in cells, but do know that with photosynthesis, the light from the sun is converted to chemical energy. Also remember that plants are known as autotrophs, right? And then if we really want to get specific, we can call them photoautotrophs because they use light. And just remember that autotrophs they create their own food, right? So they're able to generate their own food so that they can survive, right? So autotrophs are your plants, plants that you find on land, also plants that you find in the ocean, and some bacteria can also be autotrophs, but we're really just focusing on plants right now, okay? So do know that plants are the only organisms that we're dealing with that are able to utilize this process called photosynthesis, okay? So let's just do a quick comparison between autotrophs versus heterotrophs. So autotrophs, as we said, organisms that produce their own food from simple substances in their surroundings. So they're able to take in things from their surrounding environment and then create food from it. So with plants, that's going to be sunlight, but that's also going to be things like water as well as carbon dioxide. So they're going to take in H2O and CO2 as well, which we'll talk about on our next slide when we look at our formula for photosynthesis. Okay. Now, heterotrophs, on the other hand, are organisms that are unable to make their own food. They live off of other organisms. So these are going to be your animals, right? Animals, humans, right? All other types of organisms pretty much are heterotrophs. Now again, some bacteria can be autotrophs, other bacteria are not autotrophs. So it really just depends. That's why we're not really focused on bacteria, but just know that our heterotrophs are going to be our animals and our humans, while our autotrophs are going to be our plants, okay? So essentially heterotrophs must consume, right? They have to consume something. They can't just generate their own energy. They have to eat something to get energy, okay? All right. So let's talk about where photosynthesis occurs. So photosynthesis is going to be occurring in leaves, right? So this is the primary location in the plant itself. Right now, there is a component, a cellular component, right? It happens in a particular organelle. But when you're just talking about where in the plant, it's going to be the leaves. And that should make sense to you, right? If you look outside the window, you go outside on a walk today, what is the most abundant part of any plant? It's going to be the leaves. I mean, just look at the trees in our window right now, right? There are thousands and thousands of leaves on these trees. And we want to have a lot of space because photosynthesis is super important. Right? Photosynthesis creates food. The plant wants to have a lot of food, so there has to be a lot of location. That's why leaves are going to be your primary location on the plant. Now, within the leaves, right, if you look down at this image here on the bottom of the slide, this zoom in over here is going to be a microscopic image of the plant leaf. And then these guys right here, all of these little circles that you see, these are all going to be your chloroplasts. All right, so chloroplasts are going to be an organelle found within the leaf, right, within the leaf cell, where the actual process of photosynthesis takes place. All right, so the organelle chloroplast is the organelle that takes the sunlight and takes the water and takes the carbon dioxide, and it actually converts it into energy. Okay? Now, the chloroplast is found within something called the mesophyll, right? The mesophyll is this leaf tissue. So when you take a look at a large image of a leaf and then you zoom in like we did over here, all of this surrounding area is the mesophyll. And then again, those little tiny circles, those little yellow things that you're able to see, those are all of your chloroplasts within the mesophyll. Okay. Now, do also know, guys, that there's something called stomatas. Stomatas are little tiny pores within leaves. This is where the CO2 is able to come in and where the oxygen is able to leave. All right, so these are tiny little pores that allow CO2 in and O2 out of the cell. Okay? You could think of them like the pores on your skin, right? Lets sweat in, but it also lets sweat out rather, but it also lets bacteria and other things in. All right? Plants have pores too, except they're used for gases. So CO2 comes in, oxygen is leaving. Okay. All right, so photosynthesis. So let's just take a look at our formula. All right, so our formula for photosynthesis is going to be 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O plus light energy is going to give us C6H12O6 plus 6 O2. So just to make sure we all understand, 6 CO2, that is going to be our carbon dioxide. This is going to be, of course, our water. C6H12O6 is the formula for glucose, guys. You have to know that, right? And glucose is going to be, of course, our sugar. And then 6O2 is our oxygen. So essentially what we're seeing here is that when you take carbon dioxide molecules and when you take water molecules, right, and you add them together with light energy, right, so using the sun, you're going to end up converting the carbon dioxide and water by using light, and that's going to give the plant a glucose molecule, one single glucose molecule, and it's also going to produce oxygen, right, as a byproduct. That is your formula. You have to know the formula, everyone, because likely you're going to get a question on the Regent where they give you a question about photosynthesis, ask you to describe the formula. They may ask you to explain what the reactants are as well as what the products are, right? And we should remember reactants and products because we learned about that when we did enzymes, and we said that the reactants are always on the left side of the equation while the products are always on the right side, right? The reactants are what, that says what, I'm just going to leave it like that, what you put in, and the products are what you get out, right? So what you're putting into the equation versus what you're getting out. So your reactants, everyone, are your carbon dioxide and your water, and your products are your glucose and your oxygen. Now you may be saying, well, why is light energy not included as a reactant? Well, it is a reactant, but it's not included because light energy is technically going to be your enzyme, right? It's the thing that lets the process happen. So it's on the reactant side, but just realize that it's not an actual molecule, right? It's not something that's tangible. It's light. It's just from the sun, right? And so that's used as sort of an enzyme to help this process speed up. And so that's why it's not technically a reactant, okay? So again, guys, make sure you know the definition of each of these, right? Make sure you're able to identify what the molecules are in words, and as a chemical formula like this, you may have to write it out and just understand the reactants and the products as well. Okay. All right. Oops. Let's continue. All right, and so you may be asking also, like, what's with these arrows pointing up and down? They're just showing that everything stays stable, like from left and right. If you guys remember from chemistry, you have to have a balanced equation. And so this is balanced, right? We have 6 carbons, just for an example, 6 carbons in the reactants. We still have 6 carbons as a product. We have 24 hydrogens, you're still going to have those hydrogens. You have your oxygens that stay the same. It's just showing you that it's balanced. All right, so there's really not anything that you need to do chemically, but just realize that it stays balanced. Okay. All right, so let's talk about the stages real quick and just explain briefly what's happening in each one, and then we'll put it all together, and that'll be the end of this video. So there are 2 stages to photosynthesis. Your first stage is going to be your light reaction, right? Your second is going to be the Calvin cycle. Okay, these are the 2 that you must know. You may also see the light reaction called the light-dependent reaction. It could be dependent, right? And that means that it is dependent on light. You may also see the Calvin cycle known as the dark reaction because there's no light needed. But you're almost guaranteed to see it as the Calvin cycle, so just do remember that. Okay, and then if you also wanted to just break down the word photosynthesis, photo is the light part, and then synthesis is the Calvin part. This is where the actual creation of energy occurs. So let's talk about the different molecules and how they play a role. So water. So water, first of all, guys, remember, plays a very important role in photosynthesis. How is that possible? Well, water is split into O2 and H, right, everyone? So if we look at our molecule H2O, we have 2 hydrogens, right? And we have an oxygen, right? H2 plus O. Now, where do we get our oxygen and what happens to the hydrogen? Well, the oxygen, O2, right? Because recognize, everyone, there's a lot of water. There's going to be H2O, H2O, H2O. There's a ton of them being put into this plant. And they're all getting split into H's and O's, H's and O, H's and O. So when they all get split, O2, right, an oxygen will connect with another one to create O2, is released from the plant into our atmosphere. So it literally is going to go through the pores that we learned about, guys, that we just mentioned a few slides ago, right? Your stomatas, right? So it's going to go into the stomata, and it's going to just leave the plant and go into our atmosphere so we can breathe. This is why you may have heard, and why you probably know, that plants keep the earth alive, because all of the plants on Earth are undergoing photosynthesis. They're all using water to create oxygen, and that is what we breathe. The plant doesn't need oxygen, right? So it releases it. We need oxygen. Okay, and then what happens to the H's? Well, the H's stay in the chloroplast, and they move throughout it. It directly helps create ATP. This is an energy source that organisms need. Remember, in animals, animals, right? ATP is made in the mitochondria, all right? But in plants, ATP is made in the chloroplast. Right? That's what we're doing right now. That's the light reaction. It's generating energy. Okay? What about the CO2? So we figured the first part of our reaction, right? CO2 plus H2O plus light gives us glucose and oxygen. Well, we just talked about what water does. Here's what carbon dioxide does. So carbon dioxide is important as well. CO2 is absorbed by the plants from our atmosphere. So we breathe out CO2, right? This is what our eukaryotes breathe out. Every time we talk, we're breathing, we're releasing carbon dioxide. The plants bring that into their cells. And how do they bring that in? It's absorbed, once again, in the stomata, right? Those pores. And so the plant brings it in. CO2 is converted to sugar, right? So this is how plants create their own food. So as CO2 moves throughout photosynthesis, it's eventually going to go into the Calvin cycle, where it's going to get converted to glucose. Okay? So let's take a look at that in a quick chart just so you can see the differences. So our light reaction, what's happening? Well, first of all, light reaction occurs in the thylakoids, everybody, while the Calvin cycle occurs in the stroma. So when we look at a chloroplast, what we're going to notice is that there are these little round stacks, and they are all over the place. And then you're going to notice that there's liquid surrounding the outside of those thylakoids and the interior of the chloroplast. Each of these little stacks, right? These are your thylakoids. Thylakoids. The liquid is your stroma. So that's going to be your liquid inside chloroplast. And the thylakoids are these stacks inside the chloroplast. So the light reaction happens in the thylakoid, everybody. The Calvin cycle happens in the stroma. Very, very important to remember location, right? Overall, everybody, the photosynthesis process occurs in the chloroplast. But when we break it down into the two cycles, they happen in different parts of the chloroplast. Thylakoids for the light reaction, stroma for the Calvin cycle. Also, the light reaction is going to convert solar energy to chemical energy. And as we just said on the last slide, the chemical energy is ATP. Please make sure you know that. The Calvin cycle is going to convert CO2 into sugar using the ATP that we just made. This is why, everyone, that converting light into ATP is the first part of photosynthesis, because without that ATP, we would not be able to take sugar. We would not be able to take carbon dioxide, rather, and make sugar. Okay? So one more time, light reaction takes solar energy, converts it to ATP. Calvin cycle uses that ATP to take carbon dioxide and make it into a sugar. And do remember that sugar is C6H12O6, also known as glucose. Okay. The last thing to remember is the light reaction also utilizes water, and do just remember that water gets split. Remember, O2 is released as oxygen for us to breathe, and the H's help generate the ATP that we make. Okay? All right. So the last thing I'm going to do, guys, I'm going to just draw a quick diagram for you to kind of go through this whole process as once. I'm going to make it as simple as possible. I'm going to start off by creating a cell. All right? This is going to be a chloroplast. All right? So let's just remember that we are in a chloroplast. What I'm going to do is I'm going to separate this chloroplast in half just so I can, let you guys visualize the light reaction and the Calvin cycle. Okay. So the first thing that happens, everyone, is there is a sun, right? And that sun is going to emit rays of light, right? It's going to emit light. Now, in the chloroplast, there's going to be different types of structures. The first structure, as we've already decided and defined, are going to be your thylakoids, right? So these are going to be your thylakoids. And remember, everyone, thylakoids is where the light reaction occurs. So light is going to enter the thylakoids. At the same time, we have water entering the thylakoids, right? Because remember, our formula, we have our formula as 6CO2 plus 6H2O plus light gives us C6H12O6 plus 6O2. All right, so we have now shown the light part getting brought into the cell. We have shown the water part being brought into the cell. Remember, carbon dioxide is not in the light reaction, so we're not showing that yet. Well, what happens, everyone, when light enters a thylakoid and H2O also enters a thylakoid? What gets created? All right, so I'm pausing for a second because I want you to think about that question and answer it to yourself before I write it out. What is the point of the light reaction? It is to convert solar energy into what? And hopefully you said chemical energy. And hopefully you know that that chemical energy is ATP. So when we have light entering a thylakoid and we have H2O entering a thylakoid, in the light reaction, we are going to generate ATP. Now, that ATP is going to move itself to the Calvin cycle. And in the Calvin cycle, we are going to now have our CO2 enter the cell. All right, it's being brought in by the atmosphere into the chloroplast. And when you take the ATP that we just created and you add it to our CO2, we are going to break that CO2 to generate what? And I'm stopping again for you to hopefully tell me that the incorporation of CO2 into the chloroplast using the ATP we made will generate our glucose, which again is our sugar and the food that the plant needs to survive. And that's photosynthesis in a very simplified way. All right, guys, so again, hopefully you took notes on this. Hopefully you understand everything. There's going to be a couple of practice problems that you'll do right now. If you have any questions, however, please let me know. And that's it.